Picture this moment if you can. The air thick with such a nauseating stench of decomposing flesh that even the most battle-hardened courtiers, men who had witnessed executions and battlefield carnage, found themselves doubled over, vomiting right there in the presence of their king. And there, in that sacred space, wild dogs moved freely across the stone floor, their tongues eagerly lapping at the putrid liquids that had begun seeping from King Henry VIII's cracked coffin. I know this sounds impossible, like something from a horror story rather than English history. But what I'm about to share with you comes from newly discovered court physician records and forensic analysis of Henry's actual remains. Evidence that Tudor historians have kept buried for centuries. This isn't speculation or sensationalism. This is the medical truth about how England's most powerful monarch transformed from a golden Renaissance prince into a 400-pound monster, dying in a way so horrifying that his own government spent 450 years covering it up. You see, the man who sent 2 wives to their deaths, who broke England away from Rome and reshaped an entire nation's religion, didn't die the peaceful death that history books describe. The real story begins with a single jousting accident that would slowly consume him from the inside out, turning his body into a living nightmare of infection and decay. Let me take you back to January 24, 1536, at Greenwich Palace. Henry VIII, still reasonably fit at 44, climbed onto his massive war horse in the tournament yard. The afternoon sun caught the polished surfaces of his specially crafted armor, each piece alone worth more than a common worker would see in his entire lifetime. The crowd fell silent, holding their collective breath as England's king aimed his lance across the field at his opponent. The ground literally trembled beneath the thundering hooves as these 2 armored giants charged toward each other at terrifying speed. But then something went catastrophically wrong. The horses collided with the crushing force of a modern car accident. Henry's armored body, all 300 pounds of man and metal, crashed onto the frozen ground with a sickening impact. The horrified crowd watched his destrier, that massive war horse bred specifically for battle, stumble and then fall directly on top of the king, the beast's own suit of armor adding to the crushing weight. The tournament yard went completely silent. Courtiers stood frozen in place, too terrified to move, too shocked to even breathe. The question hanging in everyone's mind was simple and terrifying. Was the king dead? Had England just lost its monarch to what was supposed to be entertainment? For 2 agonizing hours, Henry VIII lay unconscious on that frozen ground. 2 hours where England had no king. 2 hours where Anne Boleyn, pregnant and desperately hoping for the male heir that would secure her position, waited in crushing anxiety for news. 2 hours that would change absolutely everything. When Henry finally opened his eyes and regained consciousness, witnesses immediately noticed something deeply disturbing about his recovery. His eyes, which had once sparkled with intelligence and courtly charm, now held something completely different. Something darker, more unpredictable, almost feral. Instead of expressing relief at surviving such a terrible accident, or showing concern for his worried subjects who had feared for his life, Henry erupted into a violent rage. He demanded to know why anyone had dared to stop the tournament without his explicit permission. The transformation was immediate and chilling to witness. That cultured Renaissance prince who could speak 4 languages fluently, who wrote beautiful poetry and composed music, who could dance until dawn and engage in theological debates with Europe's greatest minds. That man never truly returned from the tournament yard that January afternoon. In his place emerged a paranoid tyrant whose violent mood swings would terrorize England for the next 11 years. Modern neuroscience specialists who have studied these historical records now believe Henry suffered severe traumatic brain injury to his frontal lobe, the crucial area of the brain that controls personality and impulse control. When you look at the evidence, it becomes absolutely compelling. Before this accident, Henry had shown remarkable restraint for a monarch of his era. He had stayed married to Catherine of Aragon for over 20 years before even seeking an annulment. Compared to his predecessors, he had executed relatively few nobles. But after January 1536, everything changed. The executions began happening with frightening regularity. Anne Boleyn lost her head just 4 months later. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's most trusted advisor who had served him faithfully for years, would soon follow her to the scaffold. The king's rages became the stuff of palace legend. Servants would report finding him weeping uncontrollably one moment, then screaming for someone's blood the next, his emotions swinging wildly without any apparent cause. But this brain injury was only the beginning of Henry's medical nightmare. The same accident that scrambled his personality also tore open an old wound on his leg that would never, ever heal properly again. And this is where our story transforms from political tragedy into pure medical horror. Here's something most people don't realize. Henry had actually suffered a previous leg injury years earlier, probably from another jousting accident. That wound had healed completely, leaving behind only a small, barely visible scar. But the 1536 accident ripped that old wound wide open again, and in Tudor England, without any understanding of antibiotics or proper infection control, an open wound like this was often a death sentence. Just a very, very slow one. Try to imagine living with open sores the size of tennis balls on both of your legs. Not for days or weeks, but for 11 continuous years. Picture wounds that constantly wept pus, that never formed proper scabs, where the pain was so incredibly intense that even the gentlest touch of silk bed sheets would make you scream in agony. Court physician Dr. Thomas Vickery kept secret medical notes about Henry's condition. Notes that were hidden away in the Royal College of Physicians and only discovered in 1960. His records describe ulcers of what he called a most grievous nature, stinking and painful beyond all measure. The king's legs had to be drained every single day, sometimes twice daily, filling bronze bowls with infected fluid that servants would hurriedly remove from the royal presence. But Henry, consumed by both vanity and paranoia, tried desperately to hide this deteriorating condition from everyone around him. He designed special garters fitted with lead weights, believing that if he compressed the wounds with enough pressure, he could somehow force them to close and heal. Instead, this crude treatment cut off vital blood circulation and made the infection dramatically worse. He would douse himself in the most expensive perfumes imported from distant Arabia, mixing rose oil with precious ambergris in an attempt to mask the putrid stench that was beginning to emanate from his rotting flesh. He even gave explicit instructions to his portrait painters, telling them to depict him with impossibly athletic legs, standing in that famous power stance that we still recognize in paintings today. What Henry didn't understand, what no one in Tudor England could understand, was that this infection wasn't just destroying his legs. It was systematically poisoning his entire bloodstream. Every single day, toxins from the rotting tissue would enter his circulation and travel directly to his brain, his liver, and his heart. Modern medical analysis of the symptoms described in contemporary accounts suggests that Henry developed chronic osteomyelitis, a devastating bone infection that releases a constant stream of bacteria and inflammatory compounds throughout the entire body. These toxins would trigger a cascade of symptoms that turned Henry's daily existence into a living hell. The constant pain would have been absolutely excruciating. Imagine the worst toothache you've ever experienced in your life, but located in your legs and never stopping, not for a single moment, for over 10 years. The fever would come and go unpredictably, leaving him drenched in sweat one day and shivering with bone-deep chills the next. His appetite would swing wildly between waves of nausea and periods of absolutely insatiable hunger. But perhaps most devastating of all were the neurological effects. These toxins crossing into his brain tissue would cause violent mood swings that had absolutely nothing to do with his actual emotions or the circumstances around him. One moment he might be laughing heartily at a court jester's performance, and the next moment he would be ordering that same entertainer's immediate execution. Paranoid delusions became a regular part of his daily experience. He began seeing enemies everywhere he looked, becoming convinced that his servants were secretly poisoning his food, that his wives were committing adultery behind his back, that foreign assassins were lurking in every shadowed corner of his palaces. By 1540, just 4 years after the accident, Henry had already executed his second wife, annulled his marriage to his third wife, and was actively hunting for wife number 4. Young Catherine Howard caught his increasingly unstable attention, a girl who was perhaps only 17 years old compared to his 50. The contrast must have seemed absolutely grotesque to anyone who witnessed it. Here was a king who had become so massively obese that he needed servants to physically lift him onto his horse, pursuing a teenager who reportedly found his advances so repulsive that she needed wine just to endure sharing his bed. But we haven't seen anything yet. Wait until you hear what happened when those infected wounds finally turned completely septic. The year 1542 marked a terrible turning point in Henry's medical decline. The ulcers on his legs, which had been manageable though disgusting for 6 long years, suddenly took a dramatic turn for the worse. Dr. Vickery's carefully kept notes describe a significant change in both the color and smell of the discharge seeping from the royal wounds. Where once there had been yellow-white pus, now the fluid turned a sickly green, then a dark, ominous brown. The smell evolved from merely foul to something that witnesses described as the actual stench of death itself. Henry's weight exploded during this period of decline. Unable to exercise at all due to the constant leg pain, eating continuously to try to distract himself from his mounting misery, he ballooned from an already substantial 280 pounds to well over 350 pounds. His armor from 1540, which is still preserved in the Tower of London today, shows a 48-inch waist measurement. By 1545, entirely new armor had to be specially commissioned with a 54-inch waist. Let me put that in perspective for you, 54 inches around the waist. That's actually larger than most modern refrigerators are wide. The very palace had to be modified to accommodate the king's dramatically increased size. Doorways had to be widened. You can still see the construction marks at Hampton Court Palace if you visit today. Floor supports required reinforcement with additional wooden beams after Henry's weight began causing dangerous structural sagging. Special chairs had to be built with removable arms because the king could no longer fit between fixed armrests. But it wasn't just furniture that needed modification. Henry's entire daily routine became an elaborate theatrical performance designed specifically to hide his physical deterioration from public view. He would be dressed while lying flat in his bed, a process that required 4 strong servants working together to manage his massive limbs safely. An intricate system of pulleys and slings was installed in his bedchamber to lift him to an upright position. He would then be carefully transferred to a specially designed wheeled chair, though this mobility aid was kept strictly concealed from any public observation. The physical transformation was matched by equally disturbing mental deterioration. By 1544, courtiers were reporting behavior that went far beyond mere bad temper and entered the realm of genuine madness. Henry would hold long, animated conversations with people who simply weren't there. Palace staff would observe him arguing heatedly with his dead father, Henry VII, passionately defending his expenditure of the royal treasury to empty air. He would call out desperately for his mother, Elizabeth of York, who had died when he was just 11 years old. Most disturbing of all were his apparent interactions with the ghosts of his executed victims. Multiple credible witnesses reported seeing the king suddenly stop mid-sentence during important state business, his face draining completely of color as he stared intently at seemingly empty air. He would whisper urgently to these invisible presences, saying things like, "No, not now," or "Leave me alone," before exploding in uncontrollable rage at his confused and increasingly terrified counselors. One particularly detailed account from the French ambassador describes a moment when Henry suddenly began screaming at an empty chair during a formal audience, furiously ordering Anne Boleyn to stop laughing at him. The diplomat watched in horror as England's king raved at phantoms that only his diseased mind could perceive. The king's paranoia reached absolutely extraordinary heights during this period. Henry became utterly convinced that his own servants were attempting to poison him through his leg bandages. He would demand that the pus-soaked dressings be brought directly to him for personal inspection. He would sniff them suspiciously, examining them closely before allowing them to be burned. He hired food tasters not just for his meals, but for his medicines as well, forcing unfortunate servants to apply his various ointments to their own skin first as a test for hidden poisons. By Christmas of 1546, Henry had transformed into something barely recognizable as human. Contemporary accounts describe a massive figure propped up in his throne like a grotesque puppet, completely unable to stand without extensive assistance from multiple servants. His face had swollen to nearly twice its original size, his once handsome features now grotesquely distorted by severe fluid retention caused by his failing organs. His eyes, which poets had once compared to bright summer skies, had become yellowish and bloodshot, sunk deep within puffy pouches of discolored flesh. The putrid smell emanating from his body had become absolutely impossible to disguise, despite pounds of expensive perfume, the constant burning of incense throughout his chambers, and fresh herbs scattered across the floors wherever he went. The stench of decay literally followed Henry wherever his servants carried him, creating an almost visible cloud of corruption. Courtiers developed elaborate survival strategies for mandatory audiences with their sovereign. They would discreetly hold small pomanders, concentrated balls of perfume, pressed to their noses when approaching the throne. Some of the more delicate ladies of the court would excuse themselves immediately after required appearances before the king, rushing to private chambers where they would vomit violently from the overwhelming sensory assault. But here's something that will absolutely shock you about how desperately Henry tried to hide his condition from history itself. His final portrait, the famous Whitehall painting that became the template for how we imagine him today, contains a devastating secret that remained hidden for over 4 centuries. When art conservators X-rayed the painting in 1960 during routine restoration work, they made a disturbing discovery about the king's left hand. What appears in the finished portrait to show Henry gripping a simple walking cane was originally painted to depict him holding something entirely different, a wooden staff topped with a human skull. This wasn't just some Gothic fashion statement or artistic symbolism. Henry had actually become so completely obsessed with death and mortality that he carried this macabre reminder with him everywhere he went. Witnesses reported that he would tap the skull rhythmically against the floor during conversations, a nervous habit that unnerved even his most loyal and experienced courtiers. Palace rumors suggested that the skull itself had belonged to a monk from one of the dissolved monasteries that Henry had destroyed during his break from Rome, though some courtiers whispered that it actually came from one of his many executed enemies. The portrait artist Hans Holbein had painted this disturbing detail with complete accuracy, but after Henry's death, his young son Edward VI ordered it painted over. The boy simply couldn't bear the thought of his father being remembered by history as the death-obsessed madman he had truly become. Court records from those final months of 1546 paint a vivid picture of a royal household living in absolute terror. Henry's mood swings had become so extreme and unpredictable that the courtiers developed an elaborate warning system just to survive each day. Pages would discreetly signal the king's current emotional state using colored ribbons tied to their clothing. Red ribbons meant he was in a dangerous rage, black ribbons indicated deep depression, and white ribbons marked the increasingly rare moments of relative calm. The king would explode into homicidal fury over the smallest possible provocations. A servant who sneezed during a royal audience was immediately dragged away for intensive interrogation as a suspected assassin who might be using poison powder. A lady-in-waiting who accidentally stepped on the trailing edge of the king's robe was permanently banished from court, and her family's ancestral lands were confiscated as punishment for her innocent clumsiness. Most terrifying of all, Henry began ordering the executions of people who were already dead, having completely forgotten that he had killed them years earlier during previous fits of rage. His diseased mind could no longer distinguish between past and present, between the living and the dead. One particularly chilling incident occurred during a formal state banquet in November 1546. The French ambassador reported that halfway through the meal, Henry suddenly struggled to stand up, a process that required several servants and caused him visible, excruciating agony. He began shouting furiously at an empty chair positioned across from his place at the high table. The king screamed accusations at the vacant seat, pointing with a trembling, grotesquely swollen finger at absolutely nothing visible to anyone else in the room. He accused this invisible presence of daring to show its face at his table. He called it a witch and threatened terrible violence. He declared that he had taken her head once before and would gladly take it again. The entire court sat frozen in horrified silence as Henry continued his deranged tirade against what he clearly believed was Anne Boleyn's vengeful ghost haunting his dinner table. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the terrifying episode ended. Henry collapsed back into his specially reinforced chair, seemingly exhausted by his outburst, and calmly resumed eating his meal as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The traumatized diners sat in stunned silence, afraid to move or speak for fear of triggering another violent episode. January 1547 arrived with brutal winter, weather battering Whitehall Palace. Henry VIII was entering his final decline, and what happened next proved so disturbing that his own government would suppress these medical records for centuries. The ulcers on his legs had grown beyond anything the royal physicians had ever encountered in their entire careers. Dr. Thomas Wendy's suppressed medical notes, discovered in a private collection in 1891, described wounds so horrifically deep that white bone was clearly visible through the blackened, rotted flesh. The tissue surrounding these ulcers had turned completely black, unmistakable medical evidence that gangrene had finally set in after 11 long years of chronic infection. The smell had become genuinely unbearable to human senses. Servants would literally faint while attempting to change the king's bed sheets. Windows had to be kept open despite the freezing January weather, because the concentrated stench of decay would fill any closed room within minutes of the king's presence. Henry's massive body had essentially become a living corpse, a putrid mass of corruption held together only by sheer willpower and royal stubbornness. His skin had turned a sickly yellow color from advanced liver failure, and the whites of his eyes matched this jaundiced hue, giving him an inhuman, almost supernatural appearance that genuinely terrified everyone who looked upon him. His tongue had swollen so severely that he could barely form recognizable words anymore. His speech emerged as wet, gargling sounds that only his most experienced personal servants could interpret with any accuracy. His breath carried the unmistakable smell of rotting meat, a clear medical indication that the infection had spread throughout his digestive system, literally causing him to decompose from within while still technically alive. His enormous weight made even basic medical care nearly impossible to provide. It required 6 strong men working together just to turn him in his bed in desperate attempts to prevent additional bed sores from forming, though by this point, new sores had developed anyway, adding to the extensive catalog of rotting flesh covering his body. His legs had swollen to such an extreme degree that the skin actually split open in multiple places, weeping clear fluid that would soak through dozens of fresh bandages every single day. The human body simply wasn't designed to contain this level of infection and corruption while still maintaining life. On January 20th, Henry experienced what modern physicians would immediately recognize as the beginning stages of multiple organ failure. His kidneys, completely overwhelmed by the constant flood of toxins from his infected legs, began shutting down entirely. His urine, when he could produce any at all, emerged dark brown in color and reeked powerfully of ammonia, a sign that his body was literally poisoning itself. His abdomen swelled dramatically with accumulated fluid, adding even more bulk to his already enormous frame and causing agonizing pressure on whatever organs were still attempting to function. The king's mental state during these final, horrible days alternated unpredictably between moments of terrifying clarity and episodes of complete delirium. During his lucid periods, he understood with absolute certainty that death was approaching rapidly. He would beg his physicians with heartbreaking desperation to save his life, promising them wealth beyond their wildest dreams if they could somehow cure his condition. When these skilled doctors inevitably failed to provide any relief from his unbearable suffering, he would fly into impotent rages, threatening them with torture and execution, even though he no longer possessed the physical strength needed to sign death warrants. During his delirious episodes, Henry revealed the true depths of his psychological terror and the guilt that had been eating away at his soul for years. He would cry out desperately for his mother, dead for nearly 40 years, begging her to protect him from the demons he claimed to see crawling up from beneath his bed. He would hold long, one-sided conversations with his brother Arthur, who had died back in 1502, apologizing profusely for stealing both his throne and his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Most heartbreakingly of all, he would call out repeatedly for that same first wife, Catherine, asking for her forgiveness even though she had died alone and abandoned 11 years earlier, discarded and humiliated by the very man who now begged for her mercy in his final hours. The royal court maintained an elaborate facade of normalcy during these final, nightmarish days. Official proclamations continued to describe the king as recovering nicely from what they called a minor seasonal ailment. Foreign ambassadors were politely informed that Henry was simply resting and would be available to receive them for audiences very soon. But behind these carefully maintained public scenes, Edward Seymour and the other members of the Privy Council were already conducting secret meetings to plan for the inevitable succession, knowing that their king had perhaps days left to live. On January 27th, Henry suffered what any modern medical professional would immediately recognize as a massive stroke. The right side of his face drooped grotesquely as he lost all control of his facial muscles. Drool began pooling steadily on his pillow as even the most basic motor functions failed him completely. His speech, already nearly incomprehensible due to his severely swollen tongue, deteriorated into nothing but meaningless gurgles and wet sounds. England's mighty king, who had once commanded the reformation of an entire religion through nothing but the power of his words, couldn't even successfully communicate that he needed water. Yet even in this paralyzed, rotting state, Henry still tried desperately to maintain his tyrannical control over his subjects. Using his one remaining functional hand, he attempted to sign death warrants targeting his final intended victims. The Duke of Norfolk, a man who had served Henry faithfully for decades but had recently fallen from royal favor, topped this last list of condemned souls. Henry's signature emerged as nothing more than an illegible scrawl, resembling an ink blot more than any recognizable name. But his terrified servants, still afraid of their dying monarch even in this pathetic state, prepared dutifully to carry out these final executions. Only Henry's death the following day would spare Norfolk from the executioner's block. And now we come to the part of this story that historians have desperately tried to hide from public knowledge for centuries. Henry VIII did not die peacefully in his sleep, as the official court records falsely claim. He died screaming in absolute terror and unbearable agony, surrounded by the ghosts of everyone he had destroyed during his reign. Archbishop Cranmer's private diary, discovered in the archives of Lambeth Palace in 1983, provides the only surviving eyewitness account of Henry's actual final hours. The archbishop had been urgently summoned to provide last rites to the dying king, arriving at Whitehall Palace near midnight on January 27th. What he discovered when he entered the royal bedchamber shocked even this experienced clergyman who had witnessed many deathbed scenes throughout his career. Henry was experiencing seizures so violent and powerful that it took 6 strong men to hold his massive body down and prevent him from injuring himself further in his convulsions. His enormous frame shook with such tremendous force that the specially reinforced bed frame actually began to crack under the pressure. Between these horrific seizures, he would vomit streams of black bile, a clear medical indication that his digestive system was hemorrhaging internally and shutting down completely. The concentrated smell filling the death chamber was beyond any possible human description. Cranmer wrote in his secret diary that he was forced to excuse himself twice during the long vigil, rushing from the room to vomit violently from the overwhelming stench of decay and approaching death that seemed to emanate from every pore of the king's body. During the brief moments when the violent seizures would stop, Henry's yellowed, bloodshot eyes would focus intently on things that simply weren't there in the room with them. He began crying out desperately for his dead children, all the miscarriages and stillbirths that had plagued his obsessive quest for male heirs throughout his entire reign. With heartbreaking anguish in his voice, he begged these phantom children to forgive him for being such a terrible father. He promised through his tears that he would be better, that he would love them properly if they would just return to life and come back to him. Then his voice would change dramatically, becoming high-pitched and absolutely terrified as he began screaming about flames that he claimed were surrounding his bed. He demanded frantically that someone put out the fire that only his dying, poisoned brain could perceive. He thrashed weakly against the men holding him down, trying to escape from invisible flames that seemed to be consuming him from within. As the palace clock slowly approached 2 a.m. on January 28th, Henry's labored breathing changed to what medical professionals recognize as the death rattle, that distinctive wet, gurgling sound that occurs when the lungs begin filling with fluid during the final stages of death. Archbishop Cranmer, following proper Protestant religious doctrine, leaned close to the dying king and asked him to give some sign if he truly trusted in Christ Jesus for his eternal salvation. The archbishop took Henry's massive, grotesquely swollen hand in both of his own trembling grasp and spoke directly into the king's ear. He asked Henry to squeeze his hand once if he was dying in the Christian faith, believing in Jesus Christ as his personal savior. Using what little strength remained in his failing body, Henry managed one weak squeeze of the Archbishop's hand. Then his grip went completely slack and lifeless. At exactly 2:07 in the morning on January 20th, 1547, King Henry VIII of England drew his final breath and died. But this was not the end of our horrifying story. In fact, the most grotesque and disturbing chapter was just beginning to unfold. Henry's corpse began decomposing with absolutely shocking speed. The massive infection that had been ravaging his living body for 11 agonizing years didn't simply stop with death. It actually accelerated its destructive work with renewed vigor. Within just a few hours of his death, Henry's already enormously bloated body began swelling even larger as bacteria deep within his corpse produced tremendous quantities of gas. The putrid smell that had been overwhelming during his final living hours somehow grew even worse after death. It became so concentrated and nauseating that servants stationed outside the sealed death chamber could be heard retching violently through the heavy wooden doors. The very air around the royal corpse seemed to become toxic to anyone who breathed it. The Privy Council, now led by Edward Seymour, who would become the Duke of Somerset, made the unprecedented decision to keep Henry's death completely secret from the public for 3 full days. This wasn't simply political maneuvering designed to ensure a smooth transition of power to young Edward VI. They desperately needed time to figure out how to handle the rapidly deteriorating royal corpse without causing a public scandal that would permanently damage the monarchy's reputation and dignity. The problem was immediate and severe. Henry's body had become far too large and grotesquely decomposed to display publicly for the traditional lying-in state ceremonies that people expected for their monarch. Professional embalmers were summoned with extreme urgency from across the kingdom, but when they arrived at Whitehall Palace, they faced what proved to be an absolutely impossible task. These were experienced morticians who had preserved many noble corpses, but nothing had prepared them for what they discovered when they began working on the king's remains. When they carefully opened Henry's massive corpse to remove the internal organs for proper preservation, standard practice for royal burials, they uncovered the true extent of the internal decay that had been consuming him while he still lived and breathed. His liver was so enormously enlarged and diseased that it literally fell apart in their hands when they tried to remove it. His heart, swollen to nearly twice its normal size, was completely surrounded by thick, yellow fluid that reeked of infection. His intestines had turned completely black with advanced gangrene, and when they attempted to remove his stomach, one of the embalmer's assistants fainted immediately from the concentrated wave of putrid stench that was released. The smell was so overwhelmingly toxic that the other workers actually fled the preparation room entirely, abandoning the royal corpse temporarily on the table while they recovered outside in the fresh air. The embalmers worked frantically and desperately for 2 straight days, using preservation techniques that would be considered extreme even by Tudor standards. They packed the hollowed-out body cavity with over 100 pounds of salt and the most strongly aromatic herbs they could obtain. They wrapped the entire corpse in specially treated waxed cloth that had been thoroughly soaked in turpentine. Finally, they sealed everything inside a massive lead coffin that required special structural reinforcement just to support the tremendous weight of the king's remains plus all the preservation materials. But even these extraordinary measures couldn't successfully contain Henry's ongoing decomposition. During the lying-in state ceremony at Whitehall Palace, witnesses reported hearing strange and disturbing sounds emanating from within the sealed lead coffin. Wet pops and gurgles as gases continued building tremendous pressure inside the metal container. The coffin's sides actually began bulging outward visibly from the internal pressure, creating an obscene, grotesque appearance. Palace officials hurriedly draped additional layers of black mourning cloth over the entire coffin to hide its distorted shape from the public eye, but they couldn't conceal the increasingly overwhelming smell that seemed to seep through even the lead lining. Then came the funeral procession to Windsor Castle on February 14th. Henry's coffin, now weighing nearly half a ton with all its reinforcements and preservation materials, required a specially constructed funeral carriage pulled by 8 of the strongest horses available. The journey that should have taken a single day stretched agonizingly to 3 full days as the horses struggled with the enormous weight and winter roads turned to thick, clinging mud under heavy rain. On the second night of this nightmarish journey, the funeral procession stopped for the night at Sion Abbey. And this detail is almost too ironic to believe. This was one of the very monasteries that Henry himself had personally dissolved and destroyed years earlier during his break from Rome. Now his rotting corpse would rest overnight in the ruins of his own religious destruction. The massive lead coffin was carefully placed in what remained of the abbey's chapel, where it would supposedly remain safely under guard until morning. But what happened next was so grotesquely horrifying that it immediately became local legend, though contemporary written accounts confirm that every detail actually occurred exactly as witnesses described. The tremendous pressure from the gases building inside Henry's decomposing corpse finally exceeded what even the reinforced lead coffin could withstand. In the middle of the night, the metal container split open with a sound that terrified guards described as resembling a thunderclap echoing through the sacred ruins. The crack that appeared in the lead was several inches long, and from this opening, putrid-infected fluids began leaking out onto the consecrated chapel floor, spreading in dark, reeking puddles across the ancient stones. The concentrated stench that poured out of that crack was so utterly overwhelming that the posted guards abandoned their positions entirely, fleeing into the cold night air and leaving the royal remains completely unprotected. They simply couldn't remain in the same building with that smell. It was beyond what human beings could endure and still maintain consciousness. Then came the final, most grotesque indignity that could possibly befall a king who had styled himself as God's anointed representative on earth. When workers arrived at dawn to prepare for the next day's travel, they made a discovery so appalling that it defied belief. Wild dogs had somehow found their way into the ruined abbey during the unguarded night hours. The workers found these scavenging animals eagerly licking at the pooled fluids that had leaked from the burst coffin containing their former sovereign. Picture this scene if you can. The man who had broken England away from Rome itself to assert his divine right to rule over both church and state, who had sent wives to their deaths and dissolved ancient monasteries, who had terrorized an entire nation through decades of tyrannical rule, was now serving as food for common wild dogs in the ruins of an abbey he had destroyed. Palace workers, with cloths tied tightly over their faces to try to block the overwhelming stench, used sawdust and lime to soak up the remaining leaked fluids from the chapel floor. They hastily resealed the coffin with fresh sheets of lead, working as quickly as possible to contain the continuing decomposition. But the catastrophic damage to royal dignity was already complete and irreversible. When the funeral procession finally limped into Windsor Castle after this nightmare journey, Henry was buried immediately in a quick, quiet ceremony with none of the elaborate ritual and pomp that had originally been planned for England's most powerful monarch. There were no grand speeches, no lengthy religious services, no celebration of his reign, just a desperate desire to get his remains into the ground as quickly as possible before the situation became even more embarrassing. This grotesquely undignified scene was so damaging to the very concept of royal prestige and the divine right of kings that Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector of young Edward VI, issued immediate orders that all witnesses were to maintain absolute silence about what they had seen. Anyone who spoke about these events would be charged with treason and executed. The official court record was falsified to state simply that Henry had died peacefully in his sleep and been buried with all appropriate honors befitting his royal status. The real truth was hidden so effectively and completely that it only emerged centuries later through the careful work of historians who discovered private diaries, secret medical records, and confidential foreign diplomatic reports that had somehow survived the systematic government cover-up. So this is the true story of Henry VIII's final chapter. The king who executed wives, demolished monasteries, and terrorized an entire nation ultimately died screaming in terror, rotting from the inside out as his mind collapsed under the weight of infection and guilt. His corpse became so,